Jerome did not compose a commentary on Romans, but his letter 120 to Hedibia, which dates to 407, presents detailed exegesis of Romans 9. In section 10, Jerome offers an interpretation of Romans 9:14 through 29. He discusses the vessels of mercy, the vessels of wrath, and the way that God shows mercy on some while hardening the hearts of others. Jerome will rely on Origen's exegesis of Romans to answer Hedibia's 10th question, where she asks about the meaning of this passage. Jerome begins, as Origen had done, by noting the importance of interpreting Romans cautiously, and this passage in particular, saying that the interpreter needs the assistance of the Holy Spirit. Jerome seems to make a veiled criticism of one of Origen's own speculations about pre-existing causes as an explanatory mechanism for the choice of Jacob over Esau. In his early work, De Principiis, Origen proposed that God's prenatal choice of Jacob and Esau was based on the merits of their pre-existent souls. Origen moves away from this explanation in his commentary on Romans and changes the basis of God's election to his foreknowledge of the person's purpose and works. It is this latter explanation that Jerome will embrace. Without naming Origen, however, he seems to distance himself from what he must regard as Origen's erroneous initial speculation. Having described Paul's desire, born of anguish, to be accursed for the sake of his Israelite brethren, Jerome explains the continuation of the argument, saying, quote, "And since he had said this, he at once foresees a question coming from the opposite direction. What then are you saying? Have all who are from Israel perished? But how is it that you yourself and the other apostles and a countless number of Jewish people have received Christ, the Son of God?" Unquote. The question Paul must address here asks whether the whole nation of the Israelites must be said to have perished. And Jerome explains that Paul answers the question by explaining that Israel is identified in two ways and is divided into two sons, one who is according to the flesh and another who is according to the promise and the Spirit. He means thus to refer both to the division between Isaac and Ishmael and to that between Jacob and Esau. And with this introduction, Jerome proceeds to resume the rest of Paul's text, leading up to the beginning of Hedibia's passage, which is Romans 9, 6 through 13. Having finally fully prepared the immediate prior context of Hedibia's passage, Jerome proceeds to explain exactly what issue is being proposed in the Romans text. He writes, quote, "If Esau and Jacob had not yet been born and had not done anything good or evil, either to become worthy of God or to offend him, and their choice or rejection points not to the merits of each man, but to the will of the one who chooses or rejects, what then do we say? Is God unjust?" Jerome has thus finally brought his reader to the opening section of the passage Hedibia had asked about. And he continues by working his way through the next few verses and explaining the question that Paul heard coming from the opposite direction. Quote, "If this is so, and for the sake of his own will he shows mercy to Israel, and he hardens Pharaoh, then one complains and pleads in vain that we have either not done good or that we have done evil. For it would lie in his power and will, apart from good and evil works, either to choose someone or to reject him, particularly since human frailty is unable to resist his will." Unquote. For Jerome, the primary issue that Paul is trying to address here is the argument that these various examples from the Old Testament, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Moses and Pharaoh, prove that God is unjust because he chooses people for election or rejection without regard for their good and evil works, and that one's own free will is not free to choose or cooperate in the determination of one's ultimate destiny, because God's own choice in the matter is sovereign and irresistible. This is the question that has come from the opposite direction in verse 14. Is there injustice on God's part? Paul's answer is simply, by no means. But his questioner continues the argument until verse 19 by citing the verses about Pharaoh. And it is only in verse 20 that Paul's response is fully fleshed out. Jerome characterizes the argument as having presented a powerful and nearly insoluble question which was composed with reasoning drawn from the scriptures. Thus, Jerome sees the main issue as the tension between humanity's free will and the sovereign power of God. The interpretive key to his exegesis is to read the passage as a kind of dialogue between Paul and another character. In this way, the initial part of the passage asked about by Hedibia becomes the argument against Paul's thought. And the contradictory passage following after it is seen to be Paul's actual thought and his refutation to these objections. This technique of reading this passage as including an interlocutor's objections to Paul's actual line of thought is precisely how Origen had interpreted the passage. Origen refers to the hypothetical interlocutor as a persona, and explains that it is only under the persona of one contradicting him that the apostle says, is there injustice on God's part? Origen sees that the essence of the argument revolves around free will, saying, quote, the objection that God finds fault and condemns men without reason sets in motion that there is no freedom of will in man, nor does each one have it within his own power either that he be saved or that he perish. Unquote. Both Origen and Jerome read the passage this way, and both of them find Paul laying out an argument against himself before refuting it. Origen describes this as an objection raised by a persona constructed by Paul, and that begins at verse 14 and lasts until verse 19. Jerome also finds Paul prosecuting the case against himself in the same portion of the text. Jerome next turns to Paul's response to the objection. He claims that this question, quote, the apostle dissolved by a brief word, saying, who are you, O man, that you would answer God? Jerome thus sees this question from verse 20 as being the kernel of Paul's response to the persona. Jerome explains that the meaning of this response is to turn the question itself back on the questioner by pointing out that the very fact of asking the question, the questioner has shown that he himself has free choice, and that you are doing what you want, whether being silent or speaking. Jerome sees this line of argument running through the next several verses concerning the vessels, which are not able to question their maker's purpose in creating them, although he made some to be vessels of mercy and others to be vessels of shame. In contrast to the vessels of clay, however, a human being is able to resist God's will. For God, quote, produced everyone with the same destiny and has given freedom of choice so that each one does what he wants, either good or evil. Unquote. Thus, Jerome reads Paul as presenting a robust defense of humanity's freedom of choice. God wills the salvation of all and has made everyone for the same destiny, but he allows us to resist his will. Thus, God's choice and foreordination takes into consideration his foreknowledge of the person's free response to the offer. Origen's reading of Paul also locates his answer in the question posed in verse 20. He claims that in this passage, quote, the apostle is aroused against those who ask insolent questions. Origen reads the question, who are you, O man, that you should reply against God, as a most deserved exclamatory rebuke, with which Paul confronts the person who raises these complaints and things like these as a man who is impudently and inappropriately intruding into the chamber of this mystery. Origen draws an analogy to a situation with an impertinent servant questioning his master's orders. He writes, quote, "And just as a worthless slave whose master decides that some job is full of reason and use ought to be done, but the servant, being unwilling to do the work the master is commanding, begins to discuss the issue and inquire from the master, 'Why did you order this job to be done? Who benefits from it? Why is it necessary?' What more fitting answer could be given to the arrogant slave than to say to him, 'Who are you to reply against your master?' This is what is pleasing to the master. This is what seems best to him," unquote. It is interesting to note that Origen describes the servant as being unwilling to do the work the master is commanding, which, although he does not emphasize this point, clearly indicates that the servant's will is in some way independent of the master's and able to resist the master's will, so that the servant must have a certain freedom of choice. That this is Origen's underlying assumption is confirmed elsewhere in Origen's commentary when he cites 2 Timothy 2:20 to explain Romans 9:22. Origen comments, quote, "Do you hear Paul in these things in which he had no impudent opponent, how he has explained that there are various kinds of vessels? For in Romans 9, where there was no worthy hearer, but there was an opponent, he mentions only clay vessels. But in 2 Timothy 2, he says that there are vessels of gold, silver, wood, and clay. Some indeed are for honor, but others for reproach, just as he mentioned there. But although there in Romans, he was silent about the grounds for there being some for honor, some for reproach, here he has explained this openly. He says, 'For if anyone should cleanse himself from these things, doubtless from the defilements of sin, he will be a vessel for honor, sanctified and useful to the Lord, prepared for every good work. It follows, therefore, that whoever has not cleansed himself and has not washed away the stains of sin through repentance, he would be a vessel for reproach.'" Unquote. For Origen, there are grounds within us, foreknown by God, for our being the kinds of vessels we are, though Paul was silent about this in Romans 9. But his words in 2 Timothy 2 show that it is not simply a question of the divine choice. Henri Crouzel summarizes the intent of Origen's significant appeal to 2 Timothy 2 as a means of clarifying Romans 9. Quote, "There is no longer any question of reproaching God for having created us in this or that manner, so that we could never change from the condition in which we exist. It is rather a matter of a vessel of dishonor which purifies itself and so becomes a vessel of honor. The first text insists solely on the action of God, the second on the action of man. The two are complementary." Unquote. Origen insists on the need for human action as a complement to the divine action, since that is what Paul pleads for. Jerome takes up these same ideas, but abbreviates the argument by dropping the metaphor of the impertinent servant and explicitly stating that the very act of raising this objection to God shows the questioner to be exercising his free will. Jerome has also followed Origen in discerning Paul's bottom line that the alternative that we may be good or evil depends on our will. Thus, both Jerome and Origen read Paul as supporting the idea that a person's destiny is determined according to his own free choice, rather than by some kind of unjust and arbitrary election on God's part. Now, Hedibia had needed an interpretation of this passage precisely because Paul presents both his own position as well as the case against him. Paul has left very little in the way of footprints that can be followed to reconstruct the path. It is thus of paramount importance to identify what Paul's own position is. And Origen summarizes it trenchantly, quote, "It is not, therefore, that God hardens whom he wants, but the one who is unwilling to comply with patience is hardened." Origen's conclusion is, however, particularly difficult to accept given the scriptural support for the opposite position that has been cited by Paul's dialogue partner with regard to the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and it is on this point that Jerome offers a particularly compelling interpretation of Paul by drawing an analogy to the sun. Quote, "God's patience and limitless clemency must not be accused, but the hardness of those who have abused God's kindness, leading to their own perdition. In any case, the sun's heat is one, and according to the substances that underlie things, it melts some things, hardens others, loosens up others, causes others to contract. For wax melts, but mud is hardened, and yet the nature of the heat is not diverse. So too, the goodness and clemency of God, it hardens the vessels of wrath, which are prepared for destruction, that is, the people of Israel, but the vessels of mercy, which it has prepared for glory, which it has also called, that is, us, we who are not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles, it saves, but not contrary to reason, and not apart from the truth of judgment, but from antecedent causes. For some did not receive the Son of God. Others willed to receive him of their own accord." Unquote. By this analogy, Jerome shows that the different results by which some people are prepared for glory and others for perdition may follow from differences in their own characteristics rather than from a difference in the power of God, which, like the heat of the sun, radiates equally and uniformly on all. He admits that there are antecedent causes for the divine election, but they do not trace to the merits of these souls in a previous heavenly existence, but to their reception or rejection of the Son of God. This is a masterful argument, and insofar as it includes human response into the equation, it corresponds very well with the passage from Origen cited above, where 2 Timothy 2 is quoted. In this particular context, however, Jerome has not found this precise analogy anywhere in Origen's commentary on Romans. Instead, it may be traced to Origen's De Principiis, 3:1:1, book 3, 1:11, which Jerome had translated into Latin a few years before. There, Origen writes, quote, "So too, if the sun were to utter a voice, S-U-N, I melt things and dry them up, when being melted and being dried up are opposites, he would not be speaking falsely in regard to the point in question, since by the one heat, wax is melted and mud dried. Thus, the one operation which was performed through Moses revealed the hardness of Pharaoh on the one hand, and the result of his wickedness, and on the other hand, the persuasibility of the mixed Egyptian multitude who joined the Hebrews when they departed," unquote. Origen has insightfully observed that the hard-hearted Pharaoh and his army are not the only Egyptians mentioned in the biblical passage. For Exodus 12:38 speaks of a mixed multitude of Egyptians that freely chose to depart with the Israelites. Jerome is thus still following Origen. He managed to synthesize Origen's own exegesis by pulling in this analogy from De Principiis. Having thus presented the chief difficulty of the passage indicated by Hedibia, and explained both how Paul was led into it and how he responded to it, Jerome passes quickly over the rest of the passage. His final word on the subject is directed towards the rebellious vessel. Be silent, quote, "Be silent, therefore, with an eternal silence, and know your frailty, and do not provoke God with your questions, who made what he willed, so that he might stand forth as clement to some, severe toward others," unquote. Thus, just as Origen had suggested that a master might respond best to a disputatious servant by questioning that servant himself, so now Jerome also indicates that Paul has turned a question against the questioner. According to Jerome, God has followed his own will in order to show forth both his clemency and his severity, an idea which Origen expressed by saying, quote, "God has authority over us, also as the potter over the clay, to make from the same mass vessels for honor and vessels for reproach." The right answer, it would seem, must involve acknowledging the mystery that is at the heart of the interaction between human free choice and divine authority. Theological significance. The modern Thomistic theologian William Most finds in Jerome an important witness to the ancient church's general belief that, quote, "the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of grace depends on man," unquote. He paraphrases Jerome's doctrine of grace as implying that God does not save in a blind way, without consideration of human conditions and without a true judgment, but in accordance with preceding causes. Quote, "The great doctor of sacred scripture thus bears witness, clear witness, to the teaching that the fundamental reason underlying the decision as to who is to be reprobated or not is found in the disposition of the men themselves. He describes the condition in much the same way as St. Paul. It is faith. But Jerome does not explore what is the precise role of man in having this faith." Unquote.